This is what actually happened to Indigenous people in Canada. We're talking about the Indian Act. Everything is from 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. I'm summarizing it so that people learn. 1882, they banned the sale of guns and ammo to Indigenous, and it was punishable by a $200 fine and up to 6 months in prison. 1884, it became a felony to sell alcohol to an Indigenous person, and it was punishable by 6 months in prison or with or without hard labor and up to a $300 fine. In the Indian Act, there is 39 references to intoxication penalties for being, providing, or brewing up until 1970. They used to, when they first landed here, settlers, they would intentionally give Indigenous people, because they didn't have alcohol, they would give them alcohol to get them intoxicated before they started negotiating. So just like prohibition in the United States, just because you make something illegal does not mean that people can't get their hands on it, but they do it in back alleys. So Indigenous people would buy it from back alley brewers, where it would be consumed rapidly in the back alley and bushes, because the government then made it so that it eventually became against the law for Indigenous people to be drunk or to have alcohol in their possession. They wanted the Indigenous working on farmland, but they denied them modern farm tools and gave them land that was not arable, not usable to actually grow crops. During World War I and World War II, Indigenous people went to go fight in the wars, and they were allowed to drink alcohol while they were fighting in the wars, but then they would get back to Canada and they would be banned from consuming alcohol again. They were banned from being in the presence of alcohol or any establishment that sold alcohol, which meant that the people who served in the military and got back were banned from being in legions. So veterans had no access to the legions, which means they had no access to like the newsletters that would tell them all of the things they could get to help them after the war. So they actually did not have access to veteran affairs like the other veterans, and this was a way to keep them separate from white veterans. So it was in 1951 that they made it an offense for Indigenous people to be in possession of intoxicants or to be intoxicated on or off of the reserve. So they would consume it quickly to avoid being arrested or fined, which led to the myth that Indigenous people can't tolerate their alcohol, which was kind of by design. The Canadian government wanted people to think that Indigenous people couldn't handle their alcohol and made the perfect storm for that to be the case. And then obviously with the introduction of residential schools, a lot of Indigenous people to deal with the generational trauma turned to substances. So residential schools, the Indian Act removed 6 to 16-year-olds to a church-run government-funded assimilation schools, also known as residential schools. It was a prison-like environment. They a lot of the times were eating moldy food. A lot of them passed away from things like tuberculosis, and most people who survived those environments call themselves survivors. They finally removed the discriminatory liquor offenses in when? 1985. So like 40 years ago, which means 40 years ago, I would not be able to have that bottle of wine on my counter that I have. In 1884, they had the potlatch law. So they made potlatch and cultural ceremonies illegal. So like powwows, anything like that was illegal. You weren't allowed to perform it, and they were trying to replace it with Christianity. But what they were really upset about was the passing of names, titles, responsibilities of a chief to their eldest heir. Now remember that Indigenous people were also matriarchal, so they weren't necessarily just passing down things from man to man, which also white people did not like. So sometimes they would hold these events, or the potlatch, to distribute wealth, establish rank, past the chief or head of household. They do it for weddings and for births, and the Canadian government considered this excessive, wasteful, and a barrier to assimilation. And the Europeans really struggled with the fact that in Indigenous culture, it was a sign of good if you could distribute your wealth. So you would do well, you would share it. Europeans did not understand this because they viewed status as people who could hold on to wealth, so not sharing it. So in 1921 in Albert Bay, they had a potlatch and 45 people were arrested and charged. 22 people were jailed for giving speeches, dancing, and giving gifts to each other. Hundreds of masks and regalia were dispersed to collectors and museums around the world. So they took all their items and sold them off. That law was finally gotten rid of in 1951, which is why things like powwows and such are so important to Aboriginal culture, especially now. And regalia, people doing ribbon skirts and jingle dresses and all of that was actually against the law until 1951. So from 1885 to 1951, you needed an Indian agent to give you permission to leave the reserve. They use this as a way to control Indigenous people, but it wasn't actually legal. Johnny MacDonald was the one who enforced this. That's why we hear about Johnny MacDonald being like really not a good person in our history. So it wasn't legal. It was not in the act. The way that they enforced this was the Indian agents would ration or give privileges or withhold the privileges if you refuse to comply with getting permission to leave. And then not only that, but our police force would arrest and prosecute you for trespassing or vagrancy if you left the reserve without getting permission. You basically had like a sheet of paper saying why you were leaving, when you were coming back, how many days you were allowed to be gone. This was primarily done in the prairies because, again, back then farming was really big and they wanted Indigenous people to civilize themselves by becoming farmers. But you also had to get permission to sell the stuff that you were making on your farm, and they were giving them bad land to farm on. Not only that, but these passes, so in 1889, these passes were required to visit your kids at residential schools, which residential schools, they were taking the kids without permission. If you didn't give your kids, like if you did not send your kids away, you could face prison time. You were only allowed to visit your kids 4 times per year. So the schools did not close until 1996. And the goal of the schools was, quote, to kill the Indian in the child. 6,000 of the 150,000 either died or disappeared. They died of disease, malnourishment, and broken hearts. Eventually, they were so stressed, so unhappy being in the schools, their immune system started to fail them. On top of the fact that they were eating things like moldy food. And a lot of them ran away from the schools and passed away trying to get back home to their families. They didn't establish clear forms of punishment, but the principal was encouraged to beat and whip. Now, John A. Macdonald in our House of Commons is quoted saying this. And let me just be clear, John A. Macdonald is the one that Pierre Poilievre stated we should not be ashamed of, and we should go back to his time. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training institution schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. But patriarchy doesn't exist, right? In 1927, they made it if you hid your child, you would be arrested and imprisoned. And any annuities, so treating money, which is like dollars, okay? But you're supposed to get for the land that the government took from Indigenous people, you were supposed to get paid for it. All the people were supposed to get paid for it. The government would take it to pay for the schools. And they called this the final solution of our Indian problem. The attendance was mandatory in until 1969. And it was quoted in our government as being considered a cultural genocide. Now, the problem is there's something called the Sixties Scoop, okay? So basically, Indigenous school attendance was going down, and then what did they do? Family and Child Services. So, in 1959, 1% of the population of kids in Family and Child Services was Indigenous. 1960, it was 30 to 40%. So basically, as soon as they were like, you don't really have to go to the school, or they were trying to phase out the schooling, they ended up ramping up taking kids and putting them into foster care or the wards of the government. And that was another way to try and steal children from Indigenous people to indoctrinate them into white culture. And that continued until the 1980s. Follow for more, because that is only chapter 3.